quiet down. We're going to go through a lot of information really, really quick. For those of you who don't know, my name is Christian Vasquez. I'm an assistant coach at the Blake School. Before I started doing debate way too much, I used to be an economic research assistant at the University of Minnesota. If you have questions about what we go over, I'd prefer if you raised your hand immediately, just because I know people have a tendency to forget as we go through. What we're going to cover, there's a couple of goals in this lecture. The first is we're going to try to understand the basic idea of modeling the economy. We're going to go over general statistics. Really what happens in economics debates way too often in public forum is that people throw numbers back and forth, but even as an economist, I don't really care about those numbers, and it's really up to you to start to tell me what those actually mean. Then finally, we're going to go over the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. Earlier this year was the budget topic, and no one seemed to know how the Federal Reserve worked or what their actual impact on the economy was, which was really scary to say the least. You're Americans, you should know how your economy functions, or at least the basic idea of it. So first, when we go over modeling the economy, I have two different pictures up there for you, but both are of what we call the business cycle, right? So basically what that means is that the curve around the straight line is the boom and bust system, right? There are always going to be times in economic development or economic history that things are really, really good, and then there are going to be times that things are really, really bad. That straight line, though, is what we would say, hello, YouTube. That straight line is what we would say is the natural development of the economy over time due to factors that we're never, ever really going to be able to change, right? Over time, the population will continue to grow, right? Technology will continue to develop, meaning that the total amount of goods and services in our economy is going to continuously go up. My job as an economist is not necessarily to make things run as hot as possible. In other words, for the system to always be in some series of peaks, right? But rather, my job is to try to make sure that we are following as closely as possible that natural rate of growth, right? And to moderate out truly the worst times while, again, attempting to make sure that the economy doesn't overheat during the good times. We'd say that things are always in a continuous upward motion, no matter how pessimistic people might be in the world. The fact is that things do get better over time. The question is just of what rate. So finally, the job of an economist, I kind of already went over this. It's called the dismal science for a reason. Is one, I think it's really numbers and statistics heavy and no one really wants to hear about it. But also the fact is that most people, this is the part that I think is funny, is that people don't tell doctors how to do their jobs, but for whatever reason, everyone assumes they know enough about the economy to make comments on it, when they don't really realize that my job is just to keep things relatively even and not to have things swing either up or down too much. Does that make sense to everyone? Hello, Miles.
Hello.
Are you in this lecture?
So the one I went to, Matt already taught us apparently.
Oh, okay.
Christian?
Yeah.
Could you Facebook message Matt after this and tell him that we arrived?
Yes, I will do that.
Why don't you just Facebook?
Yeah, why don't you just
He
Facebook?
told me to ask him though.
Oh, well, just tell him you're here right now, because apparently this is getting recorded. Anyway, moving on, the first statistic that we're coming to is gross domestic product. At the bottom of the screen, I have a really simplistic equation for what this means. Basically, GDP is equal to consumption, right? So when you go out and purchase a good and service, that is the part of the equation that you fill in, plus investment, right, which is individual businesses going out and taking out loans to buy new equipment, to expand, to hire new workers, plus government action, right? So the government spends how much money a year? Anyone know?
Lots.
It's lots. It's $4.5 trillion is what the budget is actually set at. So they're a very significant part of this equation, right? The government is always going out and spending money and consuming goods on its own, whether those be I don't know, medical bills for veterans or F-35 jets that we throw trillions of dollars at. All of that is covered underneath government spending. And then the final part of the equation is net exports. For the United States, that isn't a major part of the equation, but it does still play a role, so we consider it important. This is the most general statistic that shows up in debate, and I'm kind of sick and tired of hearing it, right? Is GDP growth to the average person doesn't really mean much, but rather you need to be talking about it in context, right? GDP is essentially the size of the pie that we are splitting up for every individual within America, supposedly. For instance, how big is the United States' GDP right now? Anyone know?
21 21 trillion?
It's around $20 to $21 trillion right now, right? That's huge. That's the largest economy in the entire world, and that's the total value of the goods and services that exchange hands within our own economy. The question is how much does that actually get split up to you as an individual, or how much of that do you see? And we'll go over that a little bit later. Really, it's the total values measured by consumption, but there's kind of a really bad reason as to why this fails, right? So I told you it's the total value of goods and services that you go ahead and purchase. Does anyone's parents in here like take care of their grandparents at home? Or maybe like small children at home? No one? Well, just thinking about this is that there's a lot of things that we do within the economy, such as volunteer work, that aren't measured by actual like exchange of money, right? Is that you going ahead and doing this service essentially for free makes sure that your economic impact is never really felt. And really this expenditure model typically excludes women because they're forced to do a lot of this more domestic work at home, which is why like they're left out of the economic value at the end of the day, and why they're starting to see like a greater and greater like unaccounting for in terms of like the wage gap. Does that make sense to everyone? The other difference is that a real versus nominal GDP. Anyone want to take a crack at what that means? So we said that the current GDP is $20 to $21 trillion. Is that real or nominal? Abby, you looked really excited to say, and then you put your hand down.
No, I was just gonna say, I think isn't one of them like adjusted for inflation and then one's not or something?
Yeah, real GDP is adjusted for inflation. So in other words, we pick a year. I think the most common one right now is 1982 is the year that we decide to pick. We call that our anchor year. So we take the total value of a dollar back then and compare it to what it is right now, and we adjust the total GDP back to like what it would have been able to purchase, right? So even though our nominal GDP, or our total number of our total like value of goods and services in today's dollars is like 21 trillion, it's much less in terms of real value, simply because that dollar is able to buy less goods. That makes sense to everyone? Cool. Let's go into our next statistic, which is
What's
what?
the real GDP?
Real GDP is that adjusted for inflation.
No, but like what is it?
I don't know it off the top of my head. I think last time I checked, which was like last year for some reason, it was somewhere around like 15 to 16 trillion. So I'd imagine it's probably around like 16 to 17 right now.
It's 19.39 trillion.
Oh, really?
Sorry, that's just what the internet says.
No, it's 18.91.
All right, so I wasn't that far off. It's just $1 trillion off.
Yeah, not bad.
Yeah, not bad. Anyway, our next statistic is unemployment. What employment is the total measure of the possible people that could be working right now and if they're actually participating within the economy, right? We'd say that there are 3 types of unemployment. The first is cyclical, the second is structural, and the third is frictional, right? Cyclical unemployment is just things that happen during the normal business season, right? So for instance, in Minnesota, we employ a lot of snowplow drivers during the winter, right? But during the summer, hopefully, we don't need them. However, it did start snowing in May this year, which was kind of scary. But anyway, it's people that don't have their job throughout the entire season, and so that they're cyclically unemployed. For the rest of the country, this is like during holiday times when retail stores will end up coaxing more people to come and like work for them in order to cover like the rush that's happening around the season.
That's it's been happening all
It's
morning.
sort of
and all day.
concerning, but
So the air conditioning goes out, the lights are barely working. We're having a great time at the intensive.
Oh, well, the lights just went permanently.
Oh, Miles hit the light switch with his head, so that doesn't count. Okay, so cyclical is just seasonal. Not every job is needed very constantly. Structural unemployment is the one that probably people are more familiar with. It's just when your economy begins to shift from really relying on one service to swapping over to a different one.
Like automation.
Automation is part of this structural unemployment. It's just that times are changing. The one that I think of really heavily is like the Trump administration trying to cover coal miners, right? Our economy just needs less coal consumption, right? So there's nothing that you can really do in order to change over this, but the skill set that those people develop might not be working in today's economy, and so they end up being structurally unemployed because they're attempting to find jobs using skills that are no longer like relevant. The final one is frictional unemployment. What this means is just like you changing between jobs, right? So that there are like college graduates that might decide that they want to do something else. It's also you just like deciding to not use your own skill set For instance, I have a computer science degree. It's only a 2-year degree. It doesn't really mean much. But what do I do most of my time?
Coach debate.
Coach debate. So I'm technically frictionally unemployed, right? Like I don't use the skill set that I'm supposed to be using, which leads us into our final thing, which is underemployment or underutilization of skills. What this means is that the typical employment rate counts like the people that are always working, right? If you have a job, you are not technically unemployed, even if you are not using that skill set that you should be. The big joke always is that like college graduates are working as baristas at Starbucks, right? So they have skills and they have talent and like other like assets that they could be using, but instead they're underutilizing them at a job that does not require their like specific skill set, right? So even though that the unemployment rate is currently at, anyone know?
3%.
2% or something?
Yeah, it's somewhere real low, around like I think 3.4 or something crazy like that. And it's super low, and it's dipping below what we call the natural rate of unemployment. So taking these three pieces, cyclical, structural, and frictional, most economists assume that there's a natural rate of unemployment that is always going to happen around 4 to 5%. Right? But we are now dipped way below that natural rate of unemployment, so we should see that wages are starting to pick up just because the labor market is tightening, but we're not seeing that. Does anyone know why? Going back to that first thing about the
cycle.
Well, the business cycle is kind of an answer, I guess. But what we're looking at more is that the total workforce is not necessarily being utilized. After 08, 09, there was a series of years where people were just discouraged from trying and going out and getting a job at all. And so even though that they can work, they're not working in today's economy. Meaning that even though the unemployment rate continues to dip lower and lower, the labor market is not actually tightening up all that much because there are so many people that should be working that are simply not, right? For whatever various reason. Does that make sense? All right, hopping over to everyone's favorite, inflation. My great-grandparents used to like say stuff like this all the time. It's like, oh, things used to be a nickel. Like I could go and buy like a bunch of stuff down at the store and still have like money in my pocket left over at the end of the day. Inflation can just be simply understood as like every year your dollar buys less things, right? So like even though you want to go out and purchase like goods and necessities that you need to live, every year either A, your paycheck is getting smaller, or B, what is more likely is that inflation continues to be a problem in your life and you're just not having your wages keep up with it. There are two types of inflation though. The first one is cost push. What this can be understood is that input products that producers need in order to create whatever good you want, that price starts to go up for whatever reason, right? So if I, for instance, need, I don't know, like wood to make furniture and like wood prices start to go up due to various other problems, I as a producer have a couple of different options. One, I can just bite the increased cost and not pass it on to you. Or two, I do what most people do and I do pass it on to you, right? So cost push is just when the producer pushes off their additional costs onto you. Super simple to understand, hopefully. Yes, no, maybe so? Fantastic. The second type of inflation, which is much more typical, is demand pull. In other words, that as you like go out and like compete within the economy, there are goods that you really, really want, right? For instance, housing is something that everyone needs, but there's only a certain amount of houses out there for people to buy. If I have money in my pocket and I have more than you, I'm willing to pay more for that product in order to guarantee that it happens. In other words, everyone competing within a healthy market continues to drive prices up because as more people get paid, they should have the ability to pay for more products that they weren't able to do before. These are the two types of triggers for inflation. Nowadays, we would probably say that at least in the United States, it's more of cost push that is happening rather than demand pull. Just because if you look at the chart down in the bottom right, wages haven't necessarily kept up with productivity amounts, right? So even though you as an average American within the workforce might be producing more goods, you're not being directly compensated for that increase in production, right? Can anyone think of why this increase in production might be happening?
Trade war.
Trade war doesn't have much to do with the increase in production, but it's also automation and technology getting better, is that you can do a lot more at your job now, a lot quicker in most sectors of the economy due to the boost in this, which is what most people are saying is like the reason for this increase in productivity, but it makes sense that you're not getting compensated more just because it's an increased capital cost for your typical producer, rather than like them having to pay you more because you're more skilled. Right? However, this is really problematic because if your wages are not going up, but inflation might still be going up, what does that mean?
That you can't buy stuff.
I'm not able to buy as many things, right? So there's like this really big issue that maybe we need to raise the minimum wage for those at the bottom sectors or parts of the economy in order to have them be able to compete. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is probably one of the more important federal agencies that you need to study in order to get economic statistics in general. But what they measure inflation by is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Essentially, what CPI is it takes the basket of necessary and required goods that you need in order to just live. So in other words, things like food, water, shelter, electricity, right? All of those things, and attempts to see how much the price of them is going up from year to year, right? So the same thing happens during like that real versus nominal GDP question, right? Is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics picks an anchor year and compares the basket of goods to that year, right? That anchor year is 100 in the CPI index because it's the beginning, it's the 100%, like you could buy all these goods with the money that is in your pocket, right? As inflation starts to tick up, that CPI number goes up. So in other words, it should be like 105, 107, which shows that there is a small like 2% increase per year that begins to compound on top of each other. We'll get into this a bit more. The Federal Reserve is in charge of like reining in inflation, but right now we're seeing that not much is happening within the American economy, which is kind of concerning. Any questions on inflation? Fantastic. So that actually starts to launch us into the first of the two types of policies that can be implemented in the economy. The first is monetary policy, and the main actor within that is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is essentially in charge of the total supply of money that's circulating through the economy at any time, right? Any other bank across the globe is just going to be like whatever that country's central bank is. So Europe, due to like having the euro as a currency, has a European central bank rather than each individual like country setting itself up because they are only working with the euro and not necessarily their own currency. What the Federal Reserve is can be understood as the banker's bank, is that you and I don't really interact with the Federal Reserve at all, right? No individual has an account at the Federal Reserve, but rather the Federal Reserve is there in order to regulate and monitor how much banks are lending out in our current like economy that functions with a fiat currency, right? Because there's not necessarily anything material, there is something backing our currency, but it's not gold anymore. The banks have a tendency in a digitized economy to be able to create money out of nowhere, right? And they just have to be reporting back to the Federal Reserve in this fractional reserve system and making sure that they're not increasing that rate way too quickly and that there is some sort of capital within the bank that's being utilized. The Fed is in charge of that. Federal Reserve is meant to be an apolitical body. In other words, it's very similar to the CIA and FBI, in which the president might be able to appoint heads of the Federal Reserve or these other agencies. But when it comes to day-to-day function, no one in like Congress is really necessarily like checking them back or like overseeing them consistently. Again, just like those other apolitical heads, like you can be removed from office by Congress, but that's like not something that has ever happened and probably won't ever happen. The Federal Reserve is meant to have 7 governors that sit at the head of it. All 7 are appointed by the president, him or herself, and have to be approved by Congress. Currently, there are only 5 that are sitting there, which isn't necessarily that concerning. The concerning bit is that Trump's replacements for them, did anyone know the first 2 that he attempted to nominate?
All I know is that like my family was like going crazy. They're like, these people are total hacks.
Yeah, so the first one that Trump attempted to appoint was Stephen Moore, who's just kind of like this right-wing hack that believes that like, a lot of crazy things. 1, we should go back to the gold standard and like completely trash the economy. And 2, like because we have the most weapons, we can kind of do what we want within the global economy, because who's going to tell us no? He's a frequent writer for the Heritage Foundation and is very much a political figure, meaning that he would kind of ruin the apolitical status of this agency. And the second one was Herman Cain, who is the former Republican, at one time a front runner for the presidency in 2012. He's not as scary to me just because he was the former head of the St. Louis branch of the Federal Reserve. So at least he had experience with it. But again, he had very similar thoughts to Moore, which made it kind of scary. There are a couple different tools that the Federal Reserve has in order to rein in the monetary supply. The first is the reserve ratio, right? So I talked about how banks can kind of create money out of nowhere in the form of loans that they give to you as individuals, right? If I go to the bank and attempt to get a loan for, let's say, $100,000, right? In order to invest in my new business, in order to buy, new machinery that I need in my business, the bank can make that loan without the total amount of money on them, right? The Federal Reserve has mandated that in order to stop runs on the bank, that you only have to necessarily have certain amounts of physical currency on hand at the time, or at least that written to your accounts, right? Anyone want to take a guess at how much the bank should have on hand? So if I'm going and taking out that loan for $100,000, what do you think the current reserve ratio is? More than 100,000? So no, not at all. So due to the fractional reserve system, and the reserve ratio I think sits below 10% typically, so they only have to have around $10,000 or less on hand. If the Federal Reserve wants to rein in inflation, in other words, the amount of money that is currently in supply that can compete for goods, they're going to increase the reserve ratio so that banks can't necessarily make as many transactions with you as an individual as they possibly could before, right? If I require that the bank has more on hand, they can't simply go and make more additional loans without actually having that capital in place. Does that make sense to everyone?
So that would be a bad thing, right? If they have to raise the reserve ratio, and that means that fewer consumers can get loans.
So the Federal Reserve is trying to implement either contractionary fiscal policy or monetary policy, which is when they're trying to drive down inflation and drive down economic activity, right? Because I said my job as an economist was not to have the economy running as hot as possible, but rather I want to make sure that it is moderated out and we just see continuous growth. So they implement contractionary policy when they think inflation is too high, and then they implement expansionary policy, or dropping the reserve ratio, when they want more activity to take place, right? Even though the reserve ratio is a tool of the Federal Reserve, it's not much talked about. The one that is, though, is the federal interest rate. It's the rate that you're all most familiar with. It's essentially the one that gets talked about in the news of raising the interest rate from I think around 2%, 2.5% right now or higher. What that means is that the Federal Reserve essentially says to the banks that if you have to cover any of these uncovered capital that you're supposed to have in your bank, right, going back to that reserve ratio on hand, the banks are able to borrow from the Federal Reserve at the time, right, in order to get that done, but they have to borrow at that federal interest rate. That federal interest rate is then translated into the rate for most of your loans that you need as an individual, right? So if it costs the bank certain amounts of money to borrow from the Federal Reserve, they're also then going to pass that cost on to you, and so that their individual rates are kind of tied to it. There's not a one-to-one policy that is necessarily happening, but at least when they raise their interest rate, typically we also see mortgage rates and other things that you as an individual need also go up. It's not a perfect relationship, but it is at least one that exists that we can monitor. The next one is open market operations. Essentially, it's just the Federal Reserve going out and buying bonds from either banks or from the Federal Treasury, right, in order to spur on economic activity. So if I go to a bank and I say, hey, I need to buy a 10-year bond from you, right, what am I essentially doing for that bank? So if I'm buying something from you, I am
Giving you money.
giving you capital, right? If I give you additional capital, you as a bank should be using that capital in order to spur on economic growth, right? This was really the hope that would happen, and it comes kind of more into quantitative easing, which we'll get to at the end. But basically, it's an attempt by the Federal Reserve to spur on economic activity that doesn't require direct action on their part, but rather they're putting the ball in the individual bank's court instead, and hopefully they're taking it and running with it. The next one is the reserve interest rate. So just like I said that the Federal Reserve will borrow money to banks in order for them to cover it, the banks themselves might be storing money with the Federal Reserve, right? So the Bank of America might have a couple $1 million like in an account with the Federal Reserve, and they're able to collect interest on that account, similar to how you collect interest on a savings account, right? The reserve interest rate can be dropped if all of a sudden the Federal Reserve wants to encourage those banks to use that cash that's on hand and take it out of the Federal Reserve and actually go and spend it elsewhere, right? Just like I said before, the Federal Reserve is the banker's bank. It interacts and does a lot of things with individual banks, similar to how you as an individual work. All this makes sense so far? Yes, Ruby.
I'm sorry, why is it that when they lower the interest rates, it encourages banks to pull money out and spend it elsewhere?
So, think about this. If your savings account gets you, I don't know, some ungodly amount, like 10% a year, right? That's crazy. That's a better investment than I could make anywhere else. And so I'm just going to keep money there because I think it's a really safe thing. If all of a sudden the interest rate starts to drop down, though, I as a bank want to make money at the end of the day because I'm a business. So I will pull additional funds that I might have had just sitting there and use them for other things instead. Right? At the end of the day, investments are all about competition in terms of safety and return. And so if I can leave money sitting at the Federal Reserve that makes a significant amount, I'm gonna do it because it's a really, really safe bet in comparison to investing more into stocks and hedge funds, which is just legalized gambling for the most part. Abby.
I was good up until the last one about reserve interest rate.
So think of it just as the interest rate that a bank pays you on your own savings account. If that rate gets lowered, I'm more likely to take money out of that savings account and try to invest it into something else, right, in order to make a higher return on it.
Wait,
Yeah.
and so that's it's the Fed's interest rate for banks that invest money, or
That have
invest-
money sitting in accounts
Right.
with the Federal Reserve.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. The final thing we'll talk about, so those are typical tools that the Federal Reserve or other central banks will try to implement. This final one is a new one that most people consider quite controversial. It's known as quantitative easing. It's more intricate than this, but basically what this is that the Federal Reserve began to buy bonds at an excessive rate from banks all around the country, right? It was that injection of capital that I really hoped would happen, and that banks were spurred on to all of a sudden economic activity. This is implemented during the 08-09 recession, and essentially what this does is it's not physically printing money, right? But it comes pretty damn close in the fact that it is that straight injection from the federal government into these individualized banks. But the hope is that these banks would begin to use them for productive policies right away. So rather than me giving millions of dollars to individuals who will then immediately go on and spend it and fight through the economy, the hope is that banks would loosen the hold that they had on loans and everything during the recession, and they would begin normal activity again because they had this injection of capital. What this was at its peak is that the Federal Reserve would buy $80 billion worth of bonds from various institutions across the country every month, right? So all of a sudden the Federal Reserve's actual assets that it had on hand are now trillions of dollars worth of bonds that have built up. Quantitative easing was ended just a couple years ago underneath Janet Yellen, who was at the time the chair of the Federal Reserve, and the policy was stopped, not necessarily due because they were afraid of inflation or anything like that, but more so because banks actually returned to that normal economic activity, so they didn't believe that they needed to continuously spur it on, right? Whether or not quantitative easing actually worked is still kind of up for debate, and is probably the center of a lot of academic work right now, because the inflation rate is below the Fed's 2% target right now, even though this trillions of dollars of capital was injected into the economy, which seems really strange, right? Because if these banks were actually active with it, we should have at least seen a greater pickup of economic activity at the time, but we might not have gotten as much or not as much bang for our buck as we had assumed in the first place. Yes?
So like on quantitative easing, I remember during the 2016 election, Jill Stein was like, we'll solve student loan debt using quantitative easing. It's like, is that like legitimate economics or how does
Nothing
that
Jill
work?
Stein said was
I mean,
legitimate
I didn't look into that specific policy, so I'm not gonna say she's outright wrong right now. All I know is that seems like kind of probably not the case, but I won't say like definitively yes or no on it, just because I didn't do enough research and I don't think that's fair to you. Yeah, good question, but yeah, I think like a lot of what Jill Stein said is not really sound economic logic. I mean, to be fair though, any politician isn't going to have sound economic logic because they always want the economy running as hot as possible in order to get reelected, right? So their goals and an economist's goals are two very different things.
Wait, what might be the reason why the banks haven't, the quantitative easing hasn't worked?
So a lot of it is that even though these banks had all of this additional capital on hand, they might just not have wanted to risk it. Right? They might have probably just kept it in safer investments. In other words, even though they got all of this, they might have then went and reinvested it in US Treasury bonds instead because they're a really safe bet. So in other words, the federal government attempted to inject money into the economy and then banks just went and bought US debt with it instead, which is not like a great driver of economic activity. It's really, really safe and those returns are good, so it probably creates like a better structural advantage in our economy, but it doesn't actually do anything for you as an individual. Fantastic. This type of monetary policy sets up our debate between two of the most famous economists in the world. On the left is John Maynard Keynes. He's an English economist at the time that argues that instead of the laissez-faire policies that are implemented through much of the 20s and 30s, that rather during times of recession or economic downturn, that because the government is part of that GDP equation that we put up before, the government can deficit spend in order to bring spending back up and confidence to you as a consumer. On the right, did someone say something? Fantastic. On the right is F.A. Hayek, who writes the book, The Road to Serfdom. Hayek is in direct confrontation with Keynes since the get-go. Right? When Hayek first accepts a position at the London School of Economics in the 30s, he literally challenges Keynes to a series of public debates to prove that Keynes doesn't know what he's talking about, right?
Wait, what was his name again?
F.A. Hayek. It's Frederick Hayek. He's an Austrian-born economist. This series of debates actually kind of destroys Hayek's reputation for the next 2 to 3 decades, right? In fact, Hayek, even though he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist in the 70s, during the middle part of his career, he kind of retreats from economics and instead goes into politics and philosophy instead, and really sets up the Chicago School of Economics, which is more of the conservative wing when it comes to economic studies that believes very much in free market activists instead of necessarily relying on the government. Hayek kind of has this swing back into reality because after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc that relied really heavily on government intervention, people were starting to believe that maybe Hayek was right. It just took a lot longer for it to happen. Keynes at the time I think dies in the 40s, but Hayek spends a lot of his later career just basically being man, that guy sucks, blah, 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 blah. But the man isn't even alive to defend himself anymore. And so Hayek is super obsessed with this relationship. Basically, what these two economists argue is that, one, it is differing on government policy, but mostly it has to do with the role of inflation within an economy, right? They believe the opposite sides of monetary policy. Keynes really believes that the injection by central banks or action by centralized actors is good for an economy in terms of recession because you're able to react at the time. Do you need to all of a sudden invest more in infrastructure? Maybe that will bring unemployment down. Do you need to maybe invest in education or to set up better sound government policies in the future? Fine, go ahead and do it. Hayek's main argument is that, one, Keynes's book, his big 1936 work, A General Theory of Money, Employment, and Inflation, I don't know if that's the exact title, I think it's around there. the book doesn't do any mathematical work as to how this is supposed to really like continuously function within an economy. Hayek, on the other hand, says that you need to instead be bound by rules that you will always follow in order to make sure that you don't like start to sway the economy too much either way. His really big argument is that Keynes does nothing but create a continuous cycle of bubbles within the economy, that you don't know when the government should stop acting. Right, is if the government really heavily invests in some sort of sector of the economy in order to drive down unemployment, congratulations, the market itself cannot keep that naturally stable, and as soon as the government stops spending in that area, everything's going to collapse in. Right? His other big problem is he says that the central government's borrowing too much money will eventually lead to the collapse, right? The road to serfdom. They'll turn us all back into like Soviet era like slavery. I think that's a little ridiculous, but I do think that most of his generalized policies offer like a good critique of left-wing economics that people need to answer, otherwise you're probably pretty bad. Keynes, on the other hand, a lot more government. We would say that most governments today are Keynesian in some form or another because they do believe that deficit spending can happen. They seem to forget the second part of Keynes, though, which is when times are good, you need to raise taxes back up in order to pay off the deficits that you might have run up. Unfortunately, the United States is at $22 trillion worth of debt, and it might be a little bit too late to go back and start to think that. They at least lay the foundation for modern economic thinking, which is why these two are absolute giants. There's like a fun little video that's like a rap battle between the two of them. I think it's a little silly, but at least it does like condense ideas really quickly. It's like 7 minutes long.
Can you watch it?
No. You can watch it on your own time. Fantastic. So, moving from monetary policy, we now have what actual central governments are able to do, which is fiscal policy. Differing from the independent agencies, right, like the central banks are meant to be, this is what the government is able to do, right? Really, all this is at the end of the day, even though the specifics can be very like widely detailed and widely vary from each other, it's just a difference between how much taxes do you collect and then what do you do with those taxes, right? It's investment policies, so where do I want to spend this money? Remember back to our equation for GDP that government spending is a major component of that, and so governments really have the ability to start to like swing their economies into certain tracks and like either set yourself up for really good futures or really bad ones. There's also though this question as to is there such thing as inefficient spending, right? The government always taking action doesn't necessarily mean that that action is good, right? During times of recession or economic downturn, when other people are not taking action within the economy and the government is the only actor, that's probably the most effective at which like the government is able to act. We would say that their multiplier effect, in other words, when they spend $1, the economic output that comes out of that multiplier of that dollar is much higher than in good times, right? Because during times of economic prosperity, now the government is also competing with private enterprise in order to like drive investment forward, right? And the government is always going to have more money at the end of the day than like these traditional businesses, meaning that they can outcompete and actually push private businesses out of certain sectors of the economy that might be good. The other issue is like, what if I don't have enough money to cover my costs? So we talk about that the United States debt is at $22 trillion, but this gap between their ability to pay and what they need to pay for is called a deficit, right? And that deficit accumulation over decades is the total amount of debt, and that's the difference. I noticed in January that a lot of debaters were assuming that that is like interchangeable, and it is not, right? One clearly is just the accumulation of the other. Does this make sense to everyone? Fantastic. So that tale of two economists still comes into this part of our seminar. Basically, Keynes and Hayek set up this question as to what exactly each part of the government is able to do, and we really say that there's a split between economists. It's not definitive, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just say that these are the two. The first is a supply-side economist. Basically, what they really focus on or want government policies to focus on is making it so that producers at all levels have their input costs driven down, right? Your costs, when you are running a business, are generally on taxation, right? Like how much the government is taking from you at the end of the day, but also your input costs, such as labor and regulations that you have to follow, right? So supply side economist wants to make things simpler, lowering the minimum wage or keeping the minimum wage at a much lower level than others might want is a goal of theirs. Also, cutting back on the amount of regulations that they have to follow is a direct driving down of the input costs. And this kind of gets pushed into this bubble. Not all supply side economists are like in the trickle down field, but that's kind of what they've been pushed towards and labeled as for the past couple of decades, ever since Reagan, right? The idea is that if I start at the top and make sure that like the job producers, in other words, like the rich and wealthy, are all of a sudden have less burdens upon themselves, that they probably go out and spend that money. That hasn't really happened, and so it's kind of laughed at. But really, supply-side economists should at least be like lauded for the fact that they focus more not on guessing what you as an individual want within an economy, but following generalized rules that they hope are effective at any time, right? So it goes back to the critique that Hayek has of Keynes, which is that you are all of a sudden trying to like predict the future and moving resources around into really ineffective sectors of the economy that might not matter. On the other hand, demand-side economists are saying that we should focus on you as consumers, right? If we put more money in your pocket by either increasing minimum wages or like decreasing your costs in education, housing, whatever that might be, you are more active within the economy, right? Those at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum spend more of their paycheck than those at the top, meaning that they're truly the engine of activity within the economy, so we should focus on them. It's not necessary that I will invest in certain sectors of the economy in order to spur on that consumption, but demand-side economists don't necessarily have a problem with that happening, right? So they're not necessarily always directly advocating for it, but they'll definitely be okay with it. The other thing that demand-side economists focus on is incentives for you to act, right? So maybe we lower individual income taxes, or we start to create special savings accounts, such as 529s, which are education savings accounts, right? So we attempt to create things that you will move towards into the future in order to try to drive the good policies or the good actions that we necessarily want. Does that make sense to everyone? Fantastic. We're at the end of our lecture. If you have other questions, my email is always open. I'm down for questions during the school year. I know that a lot of these econ topics are really, really difficult to grasp and understand. So we want there to be a resource out there for you. That being said, I'm not gonna necessarily look at your case and be like, yeah, good, bad, or tell you directions of that, but it's more so generalized information. Are there other questions, maybe on stuff that we didn't cover during this lecture? I know we went over a lot in a too short amount of a time. Fantastic. Sophie, we cut the video.
Yeah.